All right, and now for session 8.2 on the world of Paul. We want to pick up right where we left off and talk a bit about the government of the empire. You can see here some of the senators in their meeting. It's interesting, the Roman Empire, before Julius Caesar or up through Julius Caesar, the senators had tremendous authority, but then after him, Augustus became the emperor, and then from then on, the imperial power was a lot stronger. You can see on these coins the images of the various Roman emperors in the period of the New Testament. The titles are important for these various leaders. The title Caesar does not so much describe a job description as much as a family name, which became eventually a title for emperor. The actual title emperor in Latin is imperator, and it was used of the generals. Augustus and others would take on some new titles like Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, the spiritual leader. It's interesting, we often think of, because of in America, we think of political leaders as being religiously separate, the separation of church and state. But in Rome, the emperor was the head religious person, the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, the spiritual leader of the Roman people. And the two tasks were interwoven. And in time, they came to refer to their emperors as Divi Filius. You can see it printed right here on the coin. That's Latin for the Son of God, a divine being, the son of Julius Caesar. Augustus was called God and Savior Emperor. So these titles carried with them a sense of what eventually would be called imperial worship, which was not uncommon in the A&E or the ancient Near East. In fact, in the Old Testament, we read about Nebuchadnezzar, right? Wanting a golden statue to be worshipped. As to what exactly that was, one possibility is that it was a statue of him. We know that in Egypt, the Pharaoh was seen as a god. And we know that after Alexander the Great conquered the world in the 4th century BC, that their little cults appeared all over, including one in Alexandria, the massive city in the north coast of Africa that was built in honor of him, and a cult developed that regarded him as a god. The great deeds of the emperors were heralded, including the great Roman peace, what in Latin is called Pax Romana, and high titles were given to men like Octavius. He became known as Augustus. The month he was born in is the month of Augustus, August. His worship is what it means. This was not just a religious title in the sense that we think of a religious title being, a god that you worship, but this was understood in terms of him as the patron and the benefactor of the Roman people. He had the most wealth and was in that position that warranted the highest honor. The Roman Senate consisted of 300 men of the greatest wealth and the highest positions of life. As I said before, they ruled supreme under the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. But beginning with Augustus, they were allowed only to govern certain provinces, the more peaceful provinces. The Roman emperor would rule over the more difficult places, and then the other places would simply be like vassal kingdoms where they would allow them to have their own local power structure. Rome was really, more than anything else, made up of cities, and it was divided up into various provinces, but it's really the cities that form the backbone of the Roman Empire. And what's interesting is when you look at the way these cities were structured, like how they ran themselves, it's not consistent. There's a great deal of diversity in their structure. And the provinces themselves were run with different kinds of structures. As I mentioned just a second ago, some were vassal states. Under Herod the Great, who was ruling when Jesus was born, Judea was a vassal state. by the time Jesus was crucified, it was under Roman power and Roman authority. It wasn't a vassal state anymore. Pontius Pilate would have the authority to dictate life and death matters. So there was a bit of fluidity in terms of who ruled what, from senatorial to imperial. The cities, especially Rome itself, which was the largest city and most important city. It's important to think of Rome as the empire as a commonwealth of autonomous cities. The job was to control these various, hinterlands. Produce was typically sold in the marketplaces of these cities, referred to as the agora in Greek, which was centrally located inside the cities. It was also here where the seat of government was. We meet Paul always on trial in the middle of the city, near the marketplace. And this becomes important in Christianity because Christianity starts in the sort of rural settings of Galilee, but ultimately becomes an urban phenomenon. There are different kinds of ways of classifying these different groups. So first of all, some cities were really colonies. In particular, they were Roman colonies, like the city of Philippi was populated by Roman legions. Corinth was made up of freed slaves. And each of these Roman colonies was intended to mirror life in the Roman Empire. In fact, the cities would sometimes even be structured in a similar way to the way Rome was. And the people who lived there could be then given Roman citizenship. Examples include Pisidian Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, Troas, Philippi, Corinth, Timaeus, and Syracuse. But some cities did not have to follow this Roman pattern and were regarded as free cities. Some of them took great pride in being free cities, including Ephesus, Smyrna, Tarsus, Antioch, and Syria, and Thessalonica. They basically governed themselves. They minted their own coins. They were exempt from taxes. Their highest ruling council or authority was called a church, actually, an ecclesia. The Council of Areopagus or Mars Hill. They also had politarchs or rulers, or various titles that are given to their magistrates or their officials. The list of important provinces in the time and in the world of Paul would be the ones under the emperor's rule or the imperial provinces were Cilicia, Syria, Egypt, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Pamphylia. The senatorial provinces, the ones under the rule of the senator, were Macedonia, Achaia, Asia, Crete, Bithynia, Cyprus. You could presume this latter list were basically peaceful, well-run, well-regulated places. Imperial provinces were normally a little bit more problematic. A legion was held nearby. They were governed by legates of senatorial rank, or legatas in Latin, while the minor provinces were run by prefects of an equestrian rank. And this is why Pontius Pilate is a prefect and rules as a governor in Judea as an equestrian, not a senator. Vassal kingdoms, as I mentioned a moment ago, these were the kingdoms that didn't fit into these other categories, and they were allowed to have their own kings, basically. And this was true of Herod the Great. At the time of Jesus' birth, he was governed by a king or royalty. There was a modicum of freedom. The Romans were sort of, hands off. They collected taxes. They maintained their army. But they could not mint their own coins or conduct foreign relations, which is interesting because that's one of the things we see in the New Testament quite a bit is the whole matter of coins and whose image is on it and all that. It actually became quite a matter of some problems for the early Jews in the New Testament because the coins had the pictures of the emperors who were worshipped as gods. An example of a vassal kingdom besides Judea under Herod the Great would be Galatia until 25 BC. Now, turning to the subject of religion, Religion was actually everywhere in the Roman world, or ubiquitous is a fancy way of saying that. There were temples and altars and shrines. Athens was full of idols. There were many gods, polytheism, and there really wasn't atheism, which is kind of interesting today. We would think of atheism as maybe something Paul needed to go preach to the atheists, but people already had gods. They just didn't have the kind of understanding of God that Jews had, and they certainly didn't have the understanding that Christians had. And so Christianity was a threat to the religion and the religious understanding of things. Christians, together with the Jews, rejected the big, broad views of paganism. Like Jews, Christians met in synagogues or convenient locations like houses, and they practiced in a way that mirrored the synagogue. It's important to kind of keep in mind that pagans saw temples in a very different way than the way Jews did. For example, in the pagan world, there were temples everywhere. I mean, you could have gone into a Roman city and seen a whole bunch of different temples to a whole bunch of different gods. And pagans had lots of gods and lots of temples, but Jews just had one in Jerusalem to one God. And then Christians, the question is, well, where's their temple? Of course, Paul talks about you are the temple and so on. The purpose of a temple is also different between the Christians, I should say between the Jews and the pagans. A temple in paganism, across the Roman Empire, it was the place where you housed the image of the deity. So there was this statue or whatever of the deity. The dwelling of the deity was not a meeting place for worshipers. You didn't go inside the temple to worship. Whereas, obviously, in Judaism, it was the place all Jews were supposed to go and worship and so on. Paul, however, describes the gathering of the church as the temple of God. You are the temple of God. And so the Christian view is really different. Another way that which pagans and Jews were different is the way they ran a temple. Temple worship was expensive and was underwritten by the wealthy aristocrats in the pagan world. Judaism, obviously, we know about the priesthood and societies, tithes supported what was happening at the temple. In paganism, it's interesting. The meat was taken off of the bones that were sacrificed, and the meat was then taken to the agora, the marketplace, and sold. Gods ended up with the bones. They ended up with what the leftovers were. Whereas in Judaism, Yahweh consumed the animal, and Christians would see Christ as the high priest who no longer needs a sacrifice. He was the sacrifice. Another thing that's kind of interesting is the whole realm of ethics and temple, or really religion and ethics. In paganism, ethics was more about philosophy and metaphysics than it was about practicing a certain kind of life. So religion did not automatically result in a moral life. For Jews, however, it meant the whole of one's life. Whereas for Gentiles, religion, temple activity was more about just piety, about showing up. And in fact, you might practice your religion by engaging in temple prostitution, which would have been seen, obviously in Judaism as anathema. And so also for the Christian, worshiping God was about the entire life. You are the temple of God. Pagans and Christians had a different understanding of the relationship with God. The pagan view of God was transactional. Do this for me, I'll do that for you. They would have votive offerings. They would put little statues of things in front of their gods in hopes of getting action. They would make prayers and do various things. They wanted the gods to do something for them. It was very formulaic. but gods were very capricious, and you never knew what they were going to do. And ultimately, in paganism, piety meant keeping peace with the gods, pax deorum. Basically, you're just trying to appease the gods, make them happy so they don't get mad at you. This is, obviously very different than the picture of God that we get in Christianity, which is a God who is loving God. He cares about us. Your Father knows what you need before you ask it, Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel. And so it's a very different understanding of God and how to relate to God and how to live in relationship to God. Other religious trends in the Mediterranean world. Well, there were other ways of relating to religion. Some of it was secretive, the mystery religions. They promised a personal communion with the divine. They had some kind of secret initiation that promised salvation and eternal life or life after death or something like that. And there's some famous examples of it: Mithra, Isis, Cybele, Demeter, Dionysius. They often have the themes of death and rebirth, very agricultural in their understanding. Not much is known about these mystery religions because, quite frankly, they were a mystery. There was also a lot of private religion, which we might today better refer to as just sort of superstition, magic, divinization, astrology, the interpretation of dreams and oracles, the pronouncement of curses, the understanding of demons, for example, filled the gap between the gods and humans, and the demons could just sort of move around and do all of this stuff. But sometimes you needed to get them out, and so you had to have exorcisms and that sort of thing. In the Greco-Roman world, magic, where we get the word magi, by the way, from magus, a foreign title of the Persian priests, and in the Greco-Roman world, this kind of thing was happening. It was being practiced regularly. Ephesus was a major place where it took place. And you can see here in the picture bound tablets with magical inscriptions that are from late antiquity. This magical book formed 7 pages and had a cover with a veiled woman's head and a bearded man. The whole idea was you do these various things, you could control what's going to happen. Religion was about appeasing God. Magic was about controlling God. Philosophy. The Greeks are famous for their philosophy, right? So philosophy played a central role. Philosophers wrote and gave public lectures. They wore about a characteristic garb. They had a beard and a mantle. Very famous. Athens was very famous for them. Their topics were usually things about reason and metaphysics, morals, the gods, and daily life. The two most important groups of philosophers for understanding Paul in his context would be the Epicureans and the Stoics. They're both mentioned in the New Testament. The Epicureans were an old philosophical school founded by Epicurus in 300 BC. They're essentially atheists or deists, the people who believe in a God who's uninvolved in the world. They denied any kind of divine providence. They denied any of the magical type things like divinization, prophecy, or future judgment. Their emphasis was on being free from passions and from fears, and living in tranquility and pleasure and peace of mind. They had a philosophy that a lot of people in our world would like very much. The Stoics were founded about the same time by a man named Zeno, and their name comes from the building that they were found in Athens, called the Stoa. They're basically pantheists. Pantheists believe that God is sort of in everything, or God is everything. And they affirmed divine providence and God's immanence in the world, and that there would be a future judgment of the world with fire, and a new world would be born and regenerated, and the need for reason. Now, related to the school of philosophy is rhetoric. In understanding Paul's world, you might want to know a bit about rhetoric. For the educated, this was an essential topic of study. Rhetorical schools introduced the principles and the techniques. Aristotle was the famous one who taught that rhetoric is about the means of persuading. Some of these rhetoricians could be ambassadors or lawyers who would come to your defense. And there are three big categories of rhetoric. Some rhetoric is about dissuading someone from making a future decision, what's called deliberative rhetoric. Some rhetoric is about the past, and so it's tends to defend or accuse someone about what they did in the past, and so it's called judicial. The third kind of rhetoric is called epideictic, and epideictic is about the present and about giving blame or praise in the present in order to bring about um, a desired understanding of things. This one is the one that Paul seems to use so much of. Paul's letters are filled with praise or blame, and one of the things that's kind of interesting is Paul sort of takes up this issue himself. For example, in 1 Corinthians 2 and in 2 Corinthians 10, he basically says, look, I'm not good at rhetoric. I don't do that rhetoric kind of stuff very well. And I'm not trying to use the schools and the techniques of rhetoric. I'm just, I'm trying to give you the truth here. I'm not just trying to convince you that I'm right, using clever arguments. This really is true, and I saw it and experienced it for myself. But at the same time, Paul does use certain rhetorical techniques, and it can be helpful knowing that when we're reading and understanding Paul.